Oh, there.
There we go. Good. It's on. Just a minute. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. My microphone's not working this morning. Bart's is, but mine is. Jim and Mary Trainer were the ones who made the initial contact with Bart here today. We should thank them for the we received them. Thank them. Bart's going to give a little background about himself and some of his work. I won't go into that right now. But to introduce Bart, I'd like to thank him for being a lifelong learner, teaching the Bible and the ability of the things he's done over the years. And he's got a first rate communicate on issues of man and other. And we thank him for that. And he's been dedicated to work with youth on understanding, appreciating, valuing science. Bart, we thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me start. Can everybody hear me all right? All right. Thank you. I'm loud and Italian. I like to be able to wave my arms. So thank you so much, first of all, for taking time to listen to me here at the after church today. I want to start out with, you might recognize this guy. Yeah, that's me shortly before I grew a beard. That is actually my 8th grade graduation picture. I grew up in, well, I was born in Chicago. I grew up in one of the western suburbs, and I was fascinated with weather, like a lot of my colleagues in meteorology, going back to when I was early in grade school. And yes, of course, I used to watch the TV weathercast. Yes, this is back in the Mesozoic era. There was no internet, remember? And so Chicago had 3 local news stations over the air, and I had figured out a way that if you watch the 6 and 10 o'clock news, that you could go from one station to another and catch all 3 of the weathercasts. It drove my dad nuts. He was like, why do we have to watch the weather 3 times? Got to see what everybody else is saying. But besides looking at the sky and watching TV weathercasts, I really did a lot of reading. The town I grew up in had 10 books about weather, and I think I had all of them checked out most of the time. One of the reasons I put my 8th grade graduation picture up, though, it was right about this time that I really started thinking, I'd really like to learn like what I could do to be a meteorologist when I grow up. And so I wrote a letter, yes, I wrote a letter, to the American Meteorological Society, which I had heard of. It was the professional society. It is the professional society for meteorologists in the United States. And they're headquartered in Boston. And I wrote them this letter, and a couple of weeks later, they sent me a big envelope with brochures all about all the different things you could do with a career in meteorology. And it was so exciting. I was going through every page. There was only one problem. Literally every page in these booklets had something to say about the importance of acquiring proficiency in mathematics. That was not a message I wanted to hear. Math was not my favorite subject in those days. It was not, I didn't do badly in it, but I much preferred geography and history and social studies to mathematics at that time. But you know what? And this has followed me around through life as a teacher. That was an important message for me to hear, because I realized at that point, road to a career in meteorology went through the math classroom. So I really doubled down on math in high school. And then I went on to 2 college degrees. I did my bachelor's in engineering applied mathematics at Northwestern. Go Wildcats. I'm so excited that my classmate, Randy Dean, is here today. Yes. Randy lived across the quad from me and just a few houses away when we were and we were classmates in a number of courses together in the engineering school. And of course, Randy was the starting quarterback for our football team at that time. So really exciting to see him here. And I went on to do my master's degree in meteorology at UW-Madison. A couple of watersheds in my life, watershed experiences in my life when I was in Madison. First one was that about halfway through my master's program, if you would have asked me, Bart, what do you want to do with your career, your degree in meteorology, I would have said, I don't know, work for the National Weather Service or some private forecasting service, behind the scenes someday. Well, at that point, I was offered the opportunity to be a teaching assistant for a semester, and that was a game changer. I realized that, oh my gosh, I was really meant to be in a classroom. And from that point on, my espoused career goal was to teach. And another watershed experience I had was I became very involved in the Madison area in working in outreach programs for teenagers. And in particular, I worked with an organization, an interdenominational organization called Young Life. We had a club for kids on the west side of Madison. So I really thought that God's plan for me at that point was that I was going to live in Madison happily ever after and find a job teaching in a small four-year college or junior college, teaching math and earth science and working with kids in the community. Well, there's a proverb that I've always admired. Proverbs 16:9 says, a man's mind makes plans, but God directs his steps. And I got to tell you, I made a lot of plans in those days that didn't work out, and it's a good thing they didn't, because there were much better things on the horizon, as I found out. So what happened? I finished my master's, and I took a job with a lot of my classmates at a private forecasting service in Madison, thinking I want to get a year of real-world experience before I go and teach full-time. Well, in this job, we provided forecasts for all different kinds of clients. We did forecasts for electric power companies, for farmers, for crop dusting and haying conditions, for cranberry growers in central Wisconsin, for bog forecasts. We did forecasts for school districts, electric power companies, and we did the weather for a large number of radio stations in and around Wisconsin. And that was where I got my first broadcast experience. Well, I thought, okay, this is all well and good. I had been there for about a year, and I started looking for teaching jobs, and what happens? I got offered a job at a TV station in Milwaukee. And I got to tell you, I know this is going to sound weird right now, but I was not excited when I was offered this job. I remember thinking to myself, this is so wrong. This is not the way it's supposed to work out. I want to stay in Madison. I don't want to go to Milwaukee. I don't want to be in TV. But then I thought, well, I don't have a job, so I guess I'm going to Milwaukee. And even so, I came to Milwaukee thinking, I'm going to sign 1 2-year contract at this station, work this job, and then I'm going back to Madison to my original plan and live happily ever after. Well, you can see my 2-year plan didn't work out. I wound up 28 years at Channel 6. And you know what? What a blessing it was. So many things happened. I had opportunities galore to go out and do educational talks for kids in schools. I got to teach part-time at UWM. I met my wife, Terry. We have kids. I mean, incredibly cool stuff. And it's a good thing that my plan to stay in Madison didn't work out. Now, when my job ended at Channel 6 in 2010, I came right over to UW-Milwaukee, where I have been in heaven ever since, teaching math and meteorology, and being involved in helping our undergraduate students in meteorology learn how to forecast through our innovative weather program, which sadly has gone by the wayside, but still has been an important part of my experience there. And in addition, I've been very involved still in outreach programs. UWM has this program called the Science Bag, and I've had a chance to do programs for them several different times. This was one I did dressed up as Sir Isaac Newton kind of teaching about history, which has always been my passion in addition to science. My dad was an electrician, so lightning was always one of my hobby topics, and I had a chance to do a program on that. And just a couple of years ago, I did one on weather maps. And the last thing that I do in my spare time is I still work as a weather observer part-time for the FAA down at Mitchell on weekends. So if you're ever flying out of Mitchell, I'm keeping an eye on the sky for you. All right, well, that said, let's talk a little bit about the subject of today. I want to indulge in a little bit of history here and how it is intersected with the science that I love. So I want to start with two short narratives about a forecast that went very, very bad and a forecast that was very, very correct. So close your eyes and imagine right now, it is June of 1941. And we are where? We are in Berlin. We are in Hitler's war room. And Hitler is huddled with his generals, and oh my gosh, they are planning a secret all-out assault on Russia. And this massive operation, surprise attack, has been codenamed Operation Barbarossa. And the plan is to strike Russia with an absolute knockout punch at the end of June and proceed. And the plan on paper was to send 3 massive German armies into Russia from the east, and starting with Army Group North, which would strike north and take the key city of Leningrad, which was previously called St. Petersburg and now is called St. Petersburg again. Army Group Central, which was supposed to drive straight to the east and take Moscow. And then Army Group South, which was to strike into the resource-rich areas of the Ukraine and Caucasus and eventually take the fortress city of Stalingrad. 3.5 million men in these 3 armies, the largest invasion force ever assembled. And it was literally, at that time, 80% of the German army that was being committed to this operation. Hitler, being arrogant as he was, planned and believed that his armies would be all the way to Moscow and that Russia would capitulate within 10 weeks, meaning that he expected the war to be over sometime in early September. A few of his generals are raising their eyebrows at this idea, but nonetheless, Hitler's armies proceeded into Russia with no plans and no provisions for dealing with winter weather. And daft though that may sound. Now, initially, the plan went perfectly as planned. I mean, the German armies were rolling into the western frontier of Russia, and Stalin's policies made it difficult for the Russian army to resist because he insisted that they never withdraw, and there were several cases of cities where there were just mass encirclements, and the German armies captured or killed literally every soldier. But then came the first major flaw in the plan. The late summer rains in western Russia turned many of the roads to mud. And this is what's referred to, I love this, the German name for it is Schlammperiode, the mud period. Schlamm, I love that word. Anyway, or the Russian name for it was Rasputitsa, which more literally means quagmire time. Well, in either case, that is literally what happened. And these roads in late August and September turned to mud, and the German army was literally stuck for 6 weeks I mean, this is just an example. Look at some of these actual photos of them stuck, I mean, literally waist deep in mud, trying to push their trucks and heavy equipment through. The German tanks, which were extremely heavily armored and heavy, sank up over their treads in mud and got stuck frequently. Now, the Russian tanks had the same problem, except that their tanks were a little bit lighter, and they were on the defense and didn't need to be as mobile as the Germans did. So this was a major problem. Now, why did this happen? Why didn't they foresee this? The German meteorologists, who were a brilliant crew, I mean, you know, it's amazing what a juggernaut they were. The Corps of Meteorologists, Germany had approximately 1,000 meteorologists in their military at the start of the war. By comparison, the United States had about 200. And many of the German meteorologists had the equivalent of advanced college degrees in the science. So they were a pretty smart group, but nonetheless, they did not correctly assess the possibility of this mud period. And why was that? Well, they looked at precipitation records, and they said, oh, they get a lot of heavy rain at times in July and August, but the rainfall, the precipitation records showed lighter amounts of precipitation in September and October. So why were they so stuck in September and October? Because even though there was less precipitation, those months tended to climatologically be much cloudier, and the cloudy weather reduced the evaporation of any precipitation. So it was the excess of precipitation over evaporation that kept the roads muddy through much of September and October. And it wasn't until cold weather arrived in early November that the mud began to freeze and the German armies began to roll again. Now, this is the point where cold weather becomes a factor. And one of the things that, one more mud photo before we move on. The generals began to get concerned that we better get a handle on what the weather's going to be like for this winter. We're still stuck in the mud in October. What is it going to look like? So they turned to this meteorologist in their cadre named Franz Bauer. Now, Bauer had made a reputation for himself as a long-range forecaster, but I caution you, long-range forecast, I mean, think about 3-month forecasts today. They are somewhat useful, but you have to be careful with them because there's a lot of uncertainty. So imagine in 1941 what the state of extended forecasting is. So what did Bauer do? He makes his forecast. And how did he do it? He looked at the weather records from previous winters. And he noted that the previous winter of 40-41 and the previous winter before that of 39-40 had been particularly harsh on the western frontier of Russia. And then he looked further in the records and he could find no instance where there had been 3 consecutive harsh winters. So he said, that's it. This winter is going to be normal or mild. Okay, so what happened? Well, what verified was that the winter of 41-42 turned out to be the coldest winter of the 20th century in Western Russia. By late November, the German troops were facing nights out in the open in the cold where it was running 20 to 30 below zero. And men began to fall out of ranks as frequently because of overexposure to the cold as they did because of the Russian bullets. The German offensive came to within miles of Moscow. They said that some German officers were actually able to see the towers of the Kremlin with their field glasses. They were so close. People in Moscow could hear the sound of the German artillery in the distance. But that's how close they got, and they could go no further. And the assault was turned back. Now, I should also tell you that there was a bit of conflict going on here in Berlin, because when they started trying to assess the winter forecast, there was a time in history before where a conqueror tried to go into Russia in winter. The year was 1812, and the person in question was Napoleon. Napoleon's Grande Armée, 500,000 strong, tried to march across Russia during that winter, and they did not reach their goal of taking Moscow, and they came back with literally 80% of their army gone because of exposure to the cold. And it was also a political disaster for Napoleon and the beginning of the end for him. So that was already in the minds of some. But guess what? One general tried to bring this up in a meeting. And what did Hitler do? He forbade him. He said, nobody is to bring up the winter of 1812. It's like, what? Okay, so we're just because the data is there, we're just going to not talk about it. It's essentially what happened. So, as we know from history here, the German advance was turned back as much because of the Russian winter as it was because of the German defenses, or Russian defenses. Now, an interesting story. I don't know what happened to Franz Bauer after this, but there was a considerable amount of turnover, let's put it this way, in the high command of the German Weather Service. And the new leader who emerged from 1943 till the end of the war was a quiet scientist by the name of Werner Schwertfeger. And Schwertfeger was an accomplished scientist, but also an excellent forecaster. And one of his claims to fame in the war was he made an incredibly correct forecast for the weather in the Ardennes forest in late December of 1944 for the Battle of the Bulge. The German generals knew that the only way that they could perhaps strike a victory in the Ardennes campaign was if they had cloudy weather, because they had no air force any longer at that point, and they needed cloud cover to protect their armies from being mercilessly bombed by the Allied Air Force. So what happened? Schwertfeger said in mid-December, he said, there are going to be 10 days where the Allies are not going to be able to fly. And you know what? By golly, he was correct almost exactly. From December 16th to December 26th, the Allied forces on the ground had no air cover. And as we know, a large part of the group, the 101st Airborne Division, was surrounded at the town of Bastogne. But on December 26th, the skies cleared and it allowed the campaign to move forward. Very interesting. After the war, Werner Schwertfeger eventually came to the United States, where he became a professor of meteorology at UW-Madison. So this is interesting. In the fall of 1977, I was a young pup graduate student at UW-Madison, and I had Professor Schwertfeger for one of my first major meteorology courses. And then a year later, I had him again. And I have to tell you, he was fascinating. First of all, he had an extremely thick German accent. You had to be in his class for about 3 weeks before you could kind of pick up on all of the way he pronounced things. But he was amazingly lucid as a lecturer, and he had an impeccably nice penmanship, and he wrote everything on the board. So you could be half asleep in his class if you just copied what he wrote on the board. It read like a textbook afterwards. It was amazing. One thing that was rather frustrating to us as graduate students, though, all of his exams, of course, were highly quantitative, and you had to do mathematical derivations, but he insisted that the answer to every exam question had to be ultimately written in a complete, well-written sentence. And if you didn't, some of us would get our papers back, and you'd have the numerical answer would be correct, and he would write in big red letters on the top of your paper, "Learn English," which of course was very frustrating from this man that you could barely understand sometimes. I always counted myself blessed, though, to have had Professor Schwartfeger for the classes I did in Madison. All right, let's switch gears. It is now June of 1944, and now, where are we? We are in London. We are in the Allied War Room, where Eisenhower from the United States, who's also the Supreme Allied Commander, de Gaulle from France, and Montgomery from England are all gathered around, and they are planning Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of France. And a lot of focus right now is on a British officer named Stagg. Stagg is the leader of the weather forecasting group, and Stagg has split his group into 3 groups. And 2 of them are using kind of traditional old-school forecast methods, and one of them, the American group, is using some traditional methods, but also a lot of newfangled scientific methods that have been developed in the last 10 years. And everybody's focusing on the forecast. Why is it? Well, first of all, here's the plan, right? This is the English Channel, and you can see up there the narrow Straits of Dover. That's where the Germans and everybody thinks that the Allies would obviously go. It's the narrowest part of the channel. You just go right across to the Pas de Calais, and you're in France. Well, of course, the Allies know that the Germans are going to be expecting them there. So instead, they plan that they're going to go across at the widest part of the channel. And they're going to come down right over here between Cherbourg and Le Havre and land at 5 different beaches that they've codenamed Gold, Sword, Juno, Utah, and Omaha. And this plan is dependent on an amazing number of variables. They want calm wind. They want low wave heights. They want clear skies. They want new moon, darkness. Oh my gosh, how can you get all these things to come together? So there's a lot of heat on the weather forecasters here to come up with a good forecast. And the problem is, the weather in the English Channel region in late May, which was when the invasion was supposed to originally go off, was terrible. It was like March. The storms were just marching across the channel area day after day. And everybody's wondering, what are we going to do? So a lot of focus falls on this Norwegian forecaster named Sverre Pedersen, who actually had come to the United States. He was actually had been a professor at MIT, but then he went back to Europe during the war to help out with the war effort with weather forecasting and training forecasters. And he's working, really the point man in the American group that Stagg is putting the most faith in. And what a job. Pedersen, so think about this. If this is your boss, think there's not a little bit of heat? Oh my gosh. So Pedersen and his group, here are some of the actual charts that they drew for June 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1944. And it's amazing that they could even construct charts like this. I mean, you know, in those days, there was a abundance of weather data compared to today. You know, no satellite images, only a few upper air balloons. And oh, by the way, half the stations that they were interested in weather reports from were under the control of the Germans. I don't know why, but they weren't sharing data with the Allies. Don't get it. Anyway, they're planning the invasion. They want to plan the invasion for June 4th. And Pedersen and his group say, no, it's going to be a bad day. So now Eisenhower's like, we've got till the 6th, and then otherwise we're going to have to wait another several weeks until we have all the right conditions with the moon again. So they had a meeting, and on June 4th, which was actually turned out to be a sunny, sorry, I misspoke, June 5th, they were thinking of making the invasion. On June 4th, which was a sunny day with clear skies, the weather forecasting group met with Eisenhower, and they told him, it's going to be terrible tomorrow. The next storm is coming through, and we're going to have high winds and waves and lots of thunder and lightning. Eisenhower, on a clear day, when there was no sense of what it was going to be like the next, trusted his weather forecasters. And indeed, the next day, June 5th, was terrible. Again, on June 5th, they have another meeting. And this time, Pedersen and Stagg tell Eisenhower, okay, it's bad out there right now, but there's a front coming down, and we think there's going to be a window of calm on June 6th. So again, for a second time, when there's no hint of what it's going to be like the next day, on a terrible day in the English Channel, Eisenhower again trusts his forecasters, and indeed, June 6th turns out to be the date. And this front, you can see England up there on the center right, comes through, and the sky's clear, and the D-Day invasion goes off as planned. As we know, everything was fine for D-Day, although another storm came through the English Channel in the 2 days after that, and the Allies lost a number of ships there in the Channel just offshore because of the stormy weather. Nonetheless, Pedersen received a letter of commendation from Eisenhower for his correct forecast for the D-Day weather, and he came back to this country where he was on the faculty at University of Chicago. He made some monumental research developments that have aided forecasters in the decades since then, including the development of his famous Pedersen development equation, which was still the core of how weather forecasting was done when I was a student. This paper he published at the University of Chicago in 1955. Interesting, Pedersen in 1971 came to Wisconsin for a year as a visiting professor. And that was a little before my time as a graduate student, but there was still buzz. I remember talking to a couple of colleagues who had been around a little bit earlier during that time. They said, oh yeah, that was amazing. He'd come walking down the hall and we're like, oh my gosh, there's the guy who made the D-Day forecast. He's in our building. So of course, kind of hero worship there. I always loved this quote from Pedersen about weather forecasting. He said, it is exciting. The competitive instinct, or what else one wants to call it, grows and drives the forecaster to action, careful action. A storm is neither a friend nor an enemy. It cannot be controlled, praised, or punished. But it must not come unannounced. I hate those unannounced storms. Bad. All right. Let me stop here. How are we doing on time?
We are very well. We have about 20 minutes.
Okay. So we have time for one more story? Okay. So I want to warn you, there is some math in this story. Okay? Again, everybody, giving you a chance to leave the room early if you want. Fasten your seatbelts otherwise. All right. Actually, I love, this is my favorite story. This is the story of modern weather prediction. And it really starts with a person. It starts with this man, Lewis F. Richardson. Brilliant mathematician, born and raised in England. Very important, a devout Quaker, and raised in a Quaker family. And very interesting, he finishes up his PhD in mathematics, and I can't remember, his mother made a comment that he was having, I can't remember, I think she called it like a shiftless year. He didn't know what to do with himself after he finished his degree. And I tell students who I run into who have the same problem today, it's like, you know what, it's actually not that new, to not be quite sure what you want to do next. And Richardson was this case. Well, what happened was World War I broke out. And of course, because he was a devout Quaker and a pacifist. Richardson would not take up arms, but he volunteered to be an ambulance driver, risked his life, and nearly lost it on the battlefield at the Battle of the Somme, driving too close to the front to bring back wounded soldiers. While he was over there in the trenches in France, he had a lot of time on his hands. And he started noodling around with ideas on how one might apply mathematics to weather forecasting. Now, there had already been theory laid out on mathematical ideas, on equations that could be solved to predict the future state of the atmosphere, but most had agreed that they were impractical to be able to solve in real life. Well, after several months of noodling, after the war in 1922, Richardson published an amazing little book, Weather Prediction by Numerical Process. And in this book, he outlined in great detail how one might predict the future state of the atmosphere, not by, pattern recognition, what is it like 6 hours away, and what direction is the storm moving, and that's what it's going to come to us, but literally by calculating the future behavior of the weather based on the present. All right, a little bit of math. The laws of physics that govern the atmosphere can be expressed concisely in 6 equations. Now, what is an equation? An equation is really, it's a beautiful thing. An equation is a statement of relationship. It's a statement of relationship among quantities. And in this case, when we talk about the weather, physical quantities that we call variables. And the variables of the atmosphere, the state variables, are pressure, temperature, humidity, and wind. 6 of them. Wait a minute, that's 4. No, fooled you. Wind actually has 3 components. It's what we call a vector. So there's north, south, east, west, and up, down components of the wind. So it's actually 3. So these are our 6 variables. And what a remarkable coincidence that our 6 variables relationships can be expressed among the 6 variables using 6 equations. Now, I know somewhere in this room, some of you have had algebra way back when, and you learned that if you have, for example, 2 variables, x and y, how can you solve for x and y? You can solve for x and y if you have 2 equations that involve x and y. We have a fancy name for that in mathematics. We call that a closed system. Well, this is only a little bit more complicated. Instead of 2 equations and 2 unknowns, we have 6 equations and 6 unknowns. But according to Richardson, this is great. We should be able to solve for these 6 variables. And, all right, so don't get shook up about this. These are the 6 equations. Now, they're written in the notation of calculus. And they're called the primitive equations, not because the cavemen used them, but because they actually go back to the fundamental basics of physics. And the thing I want you to note in these 6 equations, see that small letter t that appears in several of them? That stands for time. So Richardson's idea is that we're going to take these 6 equations and we're going to put the actual measurements of temperature, pressure, humidity, and wind in there, and then we're going to calculate forward in time so that given the present pressure, temperature, humidity, and wind, I'm going to be able to calculate, say, for example, a day later, the future temperature, pressure, humidity, and wind. Now, what do you call that? I call that a weather forecast. And indeed, this was the plan. Now, the back to basics thing, forget about the calculus notation, but what's really amazing is that those first 3 equations are basically a statement of the conservation of momentum. Sir Isaac Newton's famous second law, force equals mass times acceleration. The fourth one is actually a statement of the conservation of mass. which falls out of Newton's famous third law, which is that for every action, there's an opposite reaction. And essentially, this equation says that mass can neither be created nor destroyed. We can just move it around. The fifth equation is the conservation of energy as measured by temperature. And the last one is the conservation of relative humidity, of moisture, as measured by relative humidity. So here we go. Richardson says we're going to take these and we're going to solve them forward in time using computers. Oops, wait a minute. The year is 1922. What does Richardson mean by a computer? His idea of a computer is a human being with a pencil and paper. And he's going to have an auditorium full of meteorologists who are going to do calculations around the clock. And you're going to have like someone standing in this podium up there like a concert master, and they're going to try to make them all do their work at the same time. So if one group is going a little too fast, he shines a blue light on them to slow down. And if the other group is going too slow, he shines a red light on them to speed up. And they decided, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take two locations in Central Europe that we have the data for on a given day. And then we're going to take the data from the day before, and we're going to use our scheme to see if we can predict what actually evolved. So away they go. All right, so first of all, 24-hour forecast. Guess how long it took them to make the forecast for the next day? Answer, 6 weeks. Yeah, not practical. And how did the forecast verify? Not well. The day that they were trying to predict the weather for was a calm and quiet day in Central Europe. And the forecast that came out of their calculations was a veritable hurricane. So this was not good, a little discouraging. And then the thing that really slowed the process down was that Richardson decided to drop out because he caught wind of the fact that the British military wanted to know more about his forecasting techniques for military purposes. And Richardson wanted nothing to do with that. So what did he do? Interestingly, he went back to school and got another PhD in psychology. And in the 1940s, he published a series of papers on the subject. He called it the mathematical theory of war, where he sought out to literally mathematically prove that war was no practical way to solve international conflict. As we can see by the state of the world, not enough people have read his papers. I actually ran into a professor, a retired professor from our math department, Gil Walter, told me that he actually read Richardson's papers, and he said it's actually fascinating mathematics. So I don't know if any of you are inclined, but if you ever want to look up what Richardson published years later. Now, what Richardson could not imagine in 1922 was that only 28 years later, an incredibly talented group of mathematicians and scientists would be gathered at the University of Pennsylvania outside of Philadelphia. And these scientists were planning to use the exact scheme that Richardson had developed. Only now they are armed with something that Richardson did not have, the ENIAC, the granddaddy of the modern digital computer. And the ENIAC, oh my gosh, this is just a small look at it. What a stove. So it was used to generate the first computer-run weather forecast, but I gotta tell you, it is just amazing. Well, I'll tell you more about the technical details of it in a moment. But this group of forecasters, and I'm only gonna tell you about one of them, in case you've never heard of this man. One of them was John von Neumann, who some people have said is possibly the smartest man who ever lived. And John von Neumann was Hungarian. He fled Europe with the rise of the Nazis and came to the United States, and just a brilliant mathematician. Some said he was the last representative of the great mathematicians who were equally at home in pure and applied mathematics. And he made contributions in game theory, quantum physics, yes, the Manhattan Project, the development of the nuclear bomb during World War II. He was an explosion expert, and the Army wanted modeling to know how the bomb would detonate and propagate, and von Neumann was an expert in that. Fluid dynamics, which weather forecasting is a subfield of, and digital computing. So for those last two reasons, he got very involved in the project to make the first forecast. And a couple of things about the ENIAC, I mean, it's amazing. It contained nearly 18,000, what do we call these things? Vacuum tubes. Let me see here deep in my coat pocket. This is my only prop for the day. Now, you folks are old enough to, I think some of you would remember these things. I show these in my class. I show these in my meteorology class like the year before last, and it's like, I said, what is this? And several people said, a light bulb. I was like, oh my gosh. So yeah, you know, when I was growing up, I still remember the television set in my house had like about 20 or 25 of these. My dad was constantly changing them out and taking them down to the corner drugstore to test them. They had one of these testing machines in there. And you had to make sure that they were fully warmed up in order to perform optimally. My brothers and I used to like to watch this program called Lost in Space. It came on at 8 o'clock on Wednesday nights. Yeah, so here's the thing. We would always make sure that we quit playing baseball in time to go home to turn on the TV at 10 minutes to 8 so that it would warm up and we would have a clear picture to watch the whole program. All right, so the ENIAC had 18,000 of these. And you can't imagine the amount of heat that they generated. There was a rumor that said that when they turned the ENIAC on, that the lights in Philadelphia nearby went dim. I don't know if that was true, but nonetheless. And it was incredibly slow. I mean, the benchmark for measuring computing speed is the floating point operation per second, flops. So the ENIAC ran at about 5,000 flops, which let me tell you, your cell phone today can leave that in the dust. And compared today, weather forecasts are done using twin computers, one down in Tucson, Arizona, and one in Manassas, Virginia, nicknamed Dogwood and Cactus. And they run at a combined 24.2 petaflops, 24.2 quadrillion operations per second. Now, using the ENIAC, it still took them 72 hours to make the forecast for the next day. But hey, that's a lot better than 6 weeks. And it was, by the mid-1960s, weather forecasters who did not utilize computer-generated guidance in making forecasts were falling to the wayside in yielding to the higher skill of forecasters who knew how to utilize the computer guidance. And some would argue, and I would, that in many ways the improved accuracy of forecasts, thanks to digital computing and the developments that were made by the likes of Lewis F. Richardson, really made the improvement of weather forecasting one of the great scientific achievements of the 20th century. So, and it's amazing when you think of it that Lewis F. Richardson could not have even envisioned this when he first laid out his scheme. All right, I'm going to stop here. If anybody has any questions, comments in any direction you want to go. Our microphone's not working. Oh, absolutely.
Who has the first question?
Learning that forecasting has to do with a lot of truth and communication and paying for that kind of work to be done. What's our future? And what can we, what can we do about it as individuals?
Okay, great question. And the short answer is that there is great uncertainty, and I don't know. One of my classmates from UW-Madison, Dr. Louis Ussolini, just retired as the National Weather Service Director a couple of years ago, and I heard him on a radio broadcast last week talking about some of the developments that have gone on in at the federal level with the National Weather Service and the reductions. And in a 5-minute span, I heard him use the word disheartening about a half a dozen times. So yeah, it's a difficult time, and there's a lot unknown about what's going to happen in the wake of these cutbacks. What can we do about it? Well, what we can do about it, and we have this great gift as American citizens of being able to vote, and that's where we have to make a difference, is in the leadership we choose to take us forward. And let me just say this, it's so easy sometimes. There are some cutbacks that are being executed that have been on the books with the National Weather Service, leadership for a while. But these are plans for shifts and changes and reductions over a 5 to 10 year period, not 1 month. And that has been an issue. And of course, there are some changes. I mean, like for example, kind of the backbone of our input to our weather forecasting models are upper air observations that are taken every 12 hours by an international cadre of balloon launches. And the United States has now terminated the launching at 7 different stations in our network in the United States. Now, does that mean the weather forecast is going to be bad for good because of those? No, but we know that it likely will make a difference in certain key forecast situations where that data is critical to that region of the country. So, yes, my short answer is I don't know for sure what it all means, and the only thing I know to do about it is to make wise choices when I vote.
Thank you. There was a question here. Someone else, I thought.
This is a shorter question and a little happier. I remember at some point learning that things like cold fronts and warm fronts, that front notion is historically tied to the meteorologists thinking about movements of troops and things, and thinking about a front moving forward as an air mass is like a troop. I didn't know if you had a comment since we just listened to history and meteorology.
Yes. So that's an interesting story. So where did this idea of the front evolve? So kind of the cradle of modern practical weather forecasting was established by a scientist and mathematician named Wilhelm Bjerknes in the outset of the Second World War. He established what became known as the famous Bergen School of Meteorology in Norway. And among the famous scientists who worked under him were his own son, Jake Bjerknes, who later came to the United States and founded a meteorology program at UCLA. But during the war, this was when they made they were drawing essentially the first kind of modern weather maps that we look at today. And they noted that there were boundaries in the atmosphere, sharp what we call discontinuities, where the wind would shift in direction and the temperature would go from warm and moist to cold and dry. And because they noted these boundaries advanced and retreated against each other, and being familiar with the terminology of the First World War with the front in France, they termed these boundaries fronts. So That's where the term originated, and we still use it to this day. Now, a word of caution. I'll never forget my weather forecasting professor at UW-Madison used to say, you know, I don't like that term front because it encourages what he called this thinking that he called billiard ball meteorology, where he said, you know, he said, when a front comes through, do you see a hose go across the sky with points on it? He goes, no, it's not that. And, you know, understanding, I think our understanding of what physically happens with air masses is a little more refined than that today. But the front concept is still a really good one. And yeah, it goes back 100 years now.
My question has to do with Lake Michigan, and apparently this past year has been the warmest that Lake Michigan has been in years. How is that, obviously right now it is affecting the weather around here. How is it affecting the other Great Lakes with their weather, and what's it going to be like, you know, is this going to be affecting us within 6 months from now, a year from now? How does this happen, or is this like a once-in-a-lifetime thing, or is it just every few years that it's so warm, or what's going on with this?
So it is true that Lake Michigan, in our recent very warm summers, the lake water temperatures have reached levels that we've not recorded in the past. I mean, with temperatures reaching near 80 and the skin temperature of the lake, as we call it, at times in the last few summers. That is not clearly understood, though, sometimes because there's such a lag in the effect of the lake on the overall weather. And of course, you have instances like, for example, like what's going to happen this year. We had more ice on the Great Lakes this winter than I think it's been like 10 years since we had as much ice, thanks to our rather cold January and February. And of course that, all right, so one effect, for example, on a year when there's a lot of ice on the lake, and I'll go back to the last time we had a lot of ice, 2014, and there was ice on the Great Lakes all the way into the third week in March. The lakes are much slower to warm up then, and it creates situations where, for example, well, here's an impact. The Milwaukee Air and Water Show was canceled that year because of fog. And what happens is when the lake water temperature is anomalously cold, it's ripe for air masses to come across the lake and have their water vapor condensed out and form fog that you might not have if the lake water temperature had been a few degrees warmer. So, now, I just want to say parenthetically, sometimes Lake Michigan is overrated in terms of the complications. First of all, I love it when the easiest forecast I have to make is when we have days like yesterday and today, where the wind is coming off the lake out of the northeast to east. Oh my gosh, I just take the lake water temperature and add 3 degrees, and there's my high temperature for the day, and it just stays there. And of course, you know, lake effect snows are always challenging to forecast. The only thing is that here in Milwaukee, we are technically not a lake effect climate because our prevailing wind direction is from the west. It's offshore, not onshore. And you can compare that to a true lake effect climate, like on the other side of the lake in Michigan. You know, compare Muskegon. Muskegon, we average about 55 inches of snow per year here in Milwaukee. They average 110. And there's the difference of a lake effect climate versus a non-lake effect climate. So thank you for your question.
Who has the next question? You'll be next. Okay.
First of all, I have a thank you for this program, and for approximately 30 years ago, I was trying to get recertified to teach in the state of Wisconsin, and one of the classes I took at UWM was a class taught by you. So thank you so much. My question simply is, how is AI assisting forecasting, or is it at all?
Okay, so this is another one of those questions where there's a lot of uncertainty, because in terms of, yes, it's going to have some impact, but what is it? And I mean, and there's talk about this right now that, you know, there was an initial AI euphoria that so many things would be able to be handled. Will it replace human beings? Well, only to some extent in some more rote type of calculations. At least initially, that's what we're thinking. But in terms of overall its impacts, I think we're in the same boat as a lot of different professions and fields are, that the jury is out as to what extent. I think the one thing, and I see many people in my field trying to do this, is to try to embrace it and understand it rather than deny it, but at the same time not to get too euphoric about the possibilities.
This is a question. Why do you think there are so many people who deny the human impact on global climate change, when we've known since 1837 that carbon dioxide impacts the weather or heat retention? And in, 1897, Savant Arrhenius wrote this paper for Philosophical Magazine saying carbon dioxide is going to be really important, but not now. And, you know, we have all these people in Boulder, James, I can't remember his last name now, but, you know, they were proponents of global climate change being caused by man, and yet political impacts, the people who are in charge, don't want to hear this. Why do you think we still are in this state of political denial when the science is there telling us, look, you're going to have to do something?
Okay, a great question, and I'll try to make this not too long. But so, first of all, you're absolutely right. The science of the potential impacts of carbon dioxide on climate go back to the 19th century. I think actually the great mathematician Fourier was one of the first to describe the potential impacts and our understanding of the properties of carbon dioxide that lead to the retention of heat in the overall atmosphere. And then the first real instrumental confirmation of the global increase in carbon dioxide began in the late 1950s with the scientist Keeling, who established an observatory at Mauna Loa in Hawaii, and that is the longest and most continuous observation station that we have. And it clearly indicates, I mean, in 1958, the global average CO2 was 280 parts per million, and where are we today? We're somewhere north of 420 parts per million. So there's been this undeniable increase. I mean, we've had modeling, we have all kinds of scientific papers that have been published. It's an interesting story. I mean, first of all, I will say, even though that was out there, I mean, when I started as a graduate student in the late 1970s, global warming was something that was professors and graduate students talked about around the water cooler, but it didn't go much elsewhere. My perception of the first major public impact, or where the terminology global warming entered the public lexicon, was in the United States in the summer of 1988, which some of you might recall was kind of the mother of all summers in terms of heat. I mean, that summer there was widespread heat waves from the upper Midwest down through Texas and all the way across the Southeast. Here in Milwaukee, we average, 10 days per summer of 90 degrees or higher. That summer we had 36. We don't even average a full day of 100-degree weather per summer. That summer we had 6. I mean, it was just unbelievable. And for the first time, meteorologists were asked, and there was talk about global warming. Now, was that a good thing? In some ways, yes, but in some ways, no. The problem with global warming, first of all, understanding the science, is that, and I've heard one scientist say this, and I think it's really true, to be fair to people, it is a problem that is almost too big for us to wrap our heads around, both spatially and temporally. I mean, first of all, spatially, it's global. So you can't think of, I mean, for example, January of 2014 was the coldest January that we had here in Wisconsin in 30 years. And people are saying, there's no global warming. Well, if you looked at charting of the entire globe, there was only one area in the northern hemisphere that had colder than normal temperatures that month, and it was the central and northeastern United States. And on a global scale, that was the second warmest January recorded in history. But again, it wasn't in our backyard. We thought, people here, if you just look outside the window, would say, there's no warming. And then even more problematic is the temporal aspect, because the global warming signal cannot be seen in days, weeks, months, even years. You got to at least get to the decadal scale before you can start to see the signal. And that is a hard sell too. Now, I could argue with you that there's more scientific evidence for global warming and the human impact of it than there is to prove that smoking is bad for your health. But that is part of the problem is that, again, that the problem is so big. And I would offer you a recommended book by a scientist named Dr. Catherine Hayhoe. She's at Texas Tech University, and she authored a book, was just published 2 years ago, called Saving Us. And she talks a lot about the idea of the way, one of the reasons we have not advanced on the idea of grappling with this problem societally is that we have entered an era where we're not talking to each other. Is the best thing that we can do to help move forward the understanding of climate change is to talk to each other about it. And we've kind of organized ourselves into tribes where, you know, those people are blue and we're red or whatever, and forgetting that we're all human beings. And somehow we need to understand and come together. I mean, I hate the question people will ask me, do you believe in global warming? No, I don't believe in global warming. It's not a religion. I understand global warming as through the science, but so yes, it's a different animal understanding. And of course, we're in a spot. Now, Dr. Hayhoe would say that there is, within our population, there are probably only 7% of the people in the population are what she refers to as dismissives, who it's not even worth having a discussion because before you even get out of the gate, you're going to not even be listening to each other. But many other people are simply overwhelmed by the magnitude of the problem and feel that it's hopeless to try to do something about it in our lifetime. And it isn't. There is reason to believe that, you know, we can grapple with this as a human society and move forward with a solution, but it will involve coming together and not coercion that will get us there. And the last thing I'll just say is, I have felt this from the standpoint of people in the sciences, it's very interesting the way scientists have been used against each other in the dialogue process, because my major professor used to say, you know, that the only impediment, the chief impediment to scientific advancement is scientific consensus. So it's important that scientists are not too agreeable with each other. And my personal witness is that, because I swim among scientists and people of this like, and they are the most disagreeable lot of people I've ever met in my life. And it's a good thing. So we should not view a dissenting scientist's view as being testimony to the fact that it's not right. I mean, take smoking, okay? When the Surgeon General announced in 1965 that smoking is bad for your health, I bet you could find half the physicians in the United States would still tell, you know, their patients, oh, you know, it's good for your nerves. Go ahead, you can smoke. Yeah, right? You know, and I'll bet you could still find one or two outliers out there like that today. Does that mean that smoking is good for your health? No. It just means that we have an outlier. But what happens is that sometimes these dissenting voices have been given disproportionate attention, and that isn't the truth either. Okay, I went on enough. Thank you.
We do need to wrap things up now. Knowledge, enthusiasm, wisdom, and humor